You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
Different spin
I
on
won't.
it.
I won't lie. I practiced just to be sure.
You were ready
That's,
for it.
yeah. Oh God, I thought, come on, you've got to come up with something.
Hello, and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnston, and this week I'm joined by Gareth. Hello, Gareth.
Hello again.
It's good to have you back. It's been a little while. This is
It
your
has.
first.
I've been hibernating.
Yes, but hopefully you've been consuming some excellent Big Finish while hibernating, and are ready to talk about it now.
I certainly have in the last couple of weeks. Yeah. No, who am I kidding? The last week. It's been a cram, but I've got them in.
Cram, your podcast revising. I like it.
Mm.
So we've picked a few. Well, last time you were on, we looked at a couple of trilogies. We looked at a couple of we kind of picked two random-ish Big Finish trilogies out of the air and had a look at them. We were going to do the same this time, but instead we sort of decided to take a look at some earlier Big Finish releases. So we're kind of going right back to the beginning here. Sort of the first, I think everything we've got in the first sort of 20 or so monthly range releases from Big Finish. And there's some good stuff in there. It was a nice little era. I sort of think that first 50 releases is very much its own kind of era. It's Big Finish sort of setting out, being a bit experimental, figuring out what they can do, doing stories that take advantage of the audio medium and all this kind of thing. And it's sort of a very unique little bit to look at. So I'm kind of glad we're revisiting it for the purposes of this. So I sent you out to pick 6 stories. We've actually sort of ended up with 7 for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, but it's going to be fun, this, I think. So the first story on our list is the second story, Doctor Who story anyway, that Big Finish put out. It's Phantasmagoria, which is a Fifth Doctor and Turlough story. And that in itself is a bit of a rarity. There hasn't been that much just Fifth Doctor and Turlough stuff. We've had Tegan and Turlough and Nyssa Tegan and Turlough and all that kind of thing. But Five and Turlough is still sort of a fairly underrepresented TARDIS team. I suppose Phantasmagoria probably came about because it was a case of who's available in those early days. So why have you picked Phantasmagoria, and talk to us about it a bit?
Well, mostly it was because I didn't really remember it. And I thought, well, if I'm going to bother kind of digging into older releases, I should probably try and avoid the favourites. So, your Spare Parts and your Holy Terror. And I thought, well, I have heard this one. It's been a hell of a long time. And I was just curious, really, because when you go back, or in my experience, to the start of the monthly range, obviously the Sirens of Time kind of gets the focus because that's the big celebratory kickoff. But I thought, well, Phantasmagoria is the kind of first, it's sort of the proto Big Finish monthly story. It's the first one where we just have an adventure with Doctor Companion, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, how did they tackle it kind of on day one? And it's interesting you mentioned about Turlough, because that's something that's kind of fascinating looking at all of these stories is sort of what pairings they went with and what groups. And I think you're right that it was a case of Tegan was not available because really the Doctor and Turlough, that was never really a thing. Like they were in one story, but obviously that was his leaving story. Um, And later on you'd get the Doctor and Perry with Erimem as well, which again that wasn't really a thing. And I kind of wonder about the thinking behind that, whether that was kind of consciously sort of scrambling to be like, oh, we can't get Janet Fielding because she doesn't really do this anymore, or were they going, let's try and do something different. But either way, Mark Strickson, he's great. It's good to have the two of them back, and it kicks the series off pretty well. But yeah, so with Phantasmagoria, kind of the main thing to jump out at you is, or me anyway, is the cast, because you've got David Williams and Mark Gatiss. Gatiss obviously who wrote it, but there's something very funny about the fact that the first Peter Davison Doctor Who audio has the guys who kidnapped him on Doctor Who night in it. Could not get that image out of my head. Uh, but yeah, I very much imagined both of them were like, "Oh yes, we're on the waiting list to be in this as soon as possible." And they both really get into it. They're very kind of rich voice characters. Both of them are kind of doing a thing with those characters. But we've also got David Ryle in here, who, off the top of my head, I can't really say what my favourite thing, or really the main thing is that I've seen him in, but it just hearing his voice pop up was kind of like, God, they got him. That's really good for like day one. I'm kind of rambling now. So the story, it's a sort of magical one where you've got seemingly some sort of spiritual thing going on where players of card games are going missing, and natural Doctor Who fashion, it kind of turns out there's a sort of sci-fi element, and aliens do get involved later on. But for a while, it feels like it's kind of your typical Gatiss kind of horror gothic thing, because that's where he seems to be comfiest as a writer. Saying that in like my pathetic Doctor Who only sort of sphere, I haven't read a lot of his other stuff, but he really seems to enjoy kind of leaning towards horror. So it's sort of unsurprising that he kind of gravitated towards that to kind of make a spooky story. Um, yeah, what did you think? Get us on track.
I get us on. All right. I think it's an awful lot of fun, and I think
Yeah.
you're right. Its main job is to be the first regular monthly Big Finish Doctor Who adventure. Yes, we'd had Sirens of Time, and it was the big
Mm.
multi-Doctor team up, and it kind of gave us just a little taste of each Doctor. But this one is very much okay, this is a story that we are dropping right into the middle of season 21. And,
Mm.
we're already playing with the TARDIS team that we never really saw on screen. I think Turlough's an absolutely great character. I think Turlough's probably actually my favourite Fifth Doctor companion, and I do think it's a shame that they never just got a bit of a chance to be a team on their own. I mean, the Doctor and
Mm.
a male companion solo is a very, very rare thing. We don't actually see even that very often.
No.
So already it's giving us something a bit different and a bit unique, but it's a nice sort of fairly traditional Fifth Doctor story. Actually, it brings to mind the Visitation, I guess, in some ways. It's wildly different. It certainly has influences from the Doctor Who that there had been since
Mm.
it finished on TV. I think in these early Big Finishes there are clear sort of new adventures, missing adventures, that kind of thing influences that maybe Big Finish has lost over the years. It's become its own thing or become more influenced by the new series, and quite rightly too. These things do have to keep moving on. So yeah, I like this one.
So yeah, just a few other notes on it then. There is a little bit of awkwardness about it. So there are scenes where Turlough kind of talks to himself, and there are scenes where the Doctor kind of talks to himself. But you have to bear in mind, this is pretty early stuff. As far as I know, Mark Gatiss hadn't been off writing audio dramas. So like Nick Briggs had been off doing audio visuals and stuff. I don't know about Mark Gatiss. So this is the sort of thing they would kind of iron out later on. And there's also a tendency in the story where the Doctor and Turlough don't massively influence events. Well, that's kind of my understanding anyway. It was a little bit kind of inadvertently sort of New Who-ish, where, or particularly the sort of Christopher Eccleston season, where a guest character has to kind of step up and sort it out. I think it was Julia Dawkins' character. I was quite excited that she was in it because she's in Nebulous, which is the radio series with Mark Gatiss, which, if you've not heard it, is outstanding and should be definitely on everybody's list. It's very funny. But anyway, yeah, so there were some sort of character notes in there that I thought if we'd got this release a bit later on, they probably would have had another pass at that. But that's not really to say it's bad. It's just it's interesting to look back on older releases and be like, the approach, how does that compare to now? But sound wise, I mean, yeah, it's surprisingly accomplished. But you know, it shouldn't be a surprise really because Big Finish were already doing Bernie Summerfield and all sorts of stuff. And like I said, you know, with the audio visuals, they already had tacitly kind of years of experience at it.
Yeah, it's most certainly Big Finish finding the feet still, but I think that's probably something you can pick out of the first 20, 30 releases in the monthly range. And like you say, they're already doing Beneath Summerfield.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a particularly strong start. If you want to look at it that way, and I think yes, it is really. It is the start. It's the first proper Doctor Who story, the first four-parter. But yeah, Gatiss is great. It has just dawned on me that he kind of sort of name checks it in The Unquiet Dead. There's Charles Dickens exclaims, "Oh, phantasmagoria." I guess he's kind of winking towards his own work when he says that.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? But yeah, no, it's a great start. It's a good little bit of early Big Finish, and like I say, I'm glad it uses an underutilized TARDIS team. Even now, they're an underutilized TARDIS team. Shall we move on?
Yeah. Okay.
So we're looking at another fairly early Fifth Doctor story here. Then I think this is a great choice. Actually, I'm really glad you've picked this one. It's Primeval. Which is another TARDIS team that we never actually got to see on screen, but Big Finish have massively expanded on. It's the Fifth Doctor and Nyssa as kind of a solo team. There's no Adric, there's no Tegan, there's no Turlo. It's just the two of them. And it's a really good sequel / prequel to The Keeper of Traken. So it's a big kind of personal to Nyssa story, I guess. And it has one of my favourite guest appearances in. Stephen Greif is the villain and plays it absolutely beautifully. So yeah, talk to us about Primeval.
Well, I'm not certain I'd ever actually listened to it. It's one of those releases where you kind of you've got it on your pile and you can't quite recall if you've actually gone through it. But yeah, no, it's interesting because it's one of those stories that starts off with the action already underway, which was very rare with telly Doctor Who. So you'd always have your TARDIS team arrives, has a look around, what's going on, there's a dead body, etc., etc. In this one, we're following on from what I assume was maybe a cliffhanger ending in a previous story when Nyssa collapses. I don't know if that's the case actually, but it doesn't matter. You're not missing anything if you haven't heard any previous story, because they do explain that basically she's collapsed, the Doctor's panicked and taken her to Traken of, I think he says, is it thousands of years previously? Or hundreds. No, it
I
doesn't really
think it's
matter. But
thousands, yeah.
okay, yeah. So he takes her back there because he figures, well, they'll be able to deal with this the best. And you see Traken, they don't yet have a keeper, so it's all a little bit more sort of woolly the way they do things there. And they've got this kind of uneasy standoff with a villainous force that kind of lives on their periphery, and that's where Stephen Greif comes in, and obviously he's just got this ridiculous, amazing kind of villain voice on him. Stephen Greif obviously being Travis Mark One from Blake Seven, amongst other things. Yeah, the story has some really great bits in it. I think my favourite bit is probably Nyssa towards the end, who's kind of had enough. She's been kind of ignored and threatened with execution a bunch of times, and you don't often see Nissa stand up for herself. You know, she on TV she kind of suffered from the character's a bit sleepy syndrome quite often. But in this one, there's a bit where she has a gun on her, and she gets the gun off the antagonist, and she says, "I am going to shoot you and kill you unless you tell me how the stun setting works," which is just such a brilliant kind of dilemma to kind of force the antagonist into, you know, you're going to go along with this or you're potentially going to get killed. And I just thought that was incredible to see from Nissa. And there's some really interesting stuff from the Doctor in it as well, where I can't tell, and it's not a problem that I can't tell. I think it's interesting that I can't tell whether or not he kind of lets a lot of this happen through, you know, by mistake. Because he takes it on himself to go and see this antagonist guy, Stephen Greif's character, to help Nissa out because he believes that's the only way. And it's a little bit like, as a listener, you know, as a real person listening to Doctor Who, you're kind of like, come on, it's this guy's the problem here. Like he's the reason this has happened, and the Doctor doesn't really register that. And he's you know obviously massively cares for Nissa, and he's like, look, I'll do anything. I've got to try it. So he goes and tries it, and I think that's an interesting kind of the Fifth Doctor wears his heart on his sleeve. I think I said the last time I was here that I felt like the Fifth Doctor was the one who felt the most kind of duty of care to his companions. Maybe not out of all the Doctors, but certainly he's up there. So yeah, it's a kind of a flaw in his character, but a deliberate one to be like, you know, I will, I'll take this rather large risk and go and see this pretty obvious villain and get his help. But there's another bit later on where the problem has effectively been resolved, and he and Nissa are going to leave, and he says, right, well, I'm too curious. I can't leave this. I've got to go and find out this last piece of the puzzle. So they go and they have a look in the source chamber or whatever it's called, and that, of course, is the last thing that Stephen Greif's character needs in order to, you know, execute his master plan. So again, there are a couple of bits in this story where the Doctor kind of lets in an own goal, and you kind of think, was that by mistake? Is he? Because if it was Sylvester McCoy, I'd kind of come away from Primeval thinking, it was all part of his plan. Because in the end, he does. He turns it all around. It's very satisfying when he does. But yeah, interesting. Did you? What about you? Did you think was he was he ahead of the game, or was he kind of letting his concern for his companion and his own kind of curiosity get in the way?
I don't think the Fifth Doctor is ever ahead of the game, really.
Oh, ouch!
I think it's an integral
No, it's
part of
true.
the character. Actually,
Yeah.
there's a level of desperation built up around the Fifth Doctor, and obviously this is set post Earthshock, so we've already lost Adric, and I think that
Mm.
actually that sort of adds to what's going on a little bit. Like he is a bit desperate. He's determined to save Nissa, and makes
Yeah.
mistakes because of that, and because of obviously what did happen with Adric. I think that you mentioned that obviously Nissa's collapsed previously. I think it's actually a
Yeah.
link back to when she collapses at the end of Four to Doomsday, um, and
Oh,
it's presented here as an ongoing problem. Like Doomsday wasn't the only time that she collapsed,
that's
and
true. Yeah, the
she had a
baddie
nap
does
through
reference this,
Kinder,
doesn't
didn't
he?
she?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think that's what it is. It's kind of sort of retroactively going, oh, well, that was a bigger problem than you think it is, and sort of 2 days sleep during Kinder didn't quite solve everything.
Hmm.
So I think that's where it's going. I've little to add to what you've said already. It was quite comprehensive, but again, I'm just going to mention how brilliant Stephen Greif's voice was, and I loved the fact that he came back when Big Finish started doing Blake Seven, and it's
Hmm.
genuinely as a voice that I'm going to miss at Big Finish now he's no longer with us. But
Yeah.
it's such a fantastic performance, and it does sort of make you wonder, well, why did it take, collectively, why did it take until 2001 to cast him in Doctor Who? Because actually, he'd have been a cracking villain in the 80s. Could you imagine him as the Borad or something like that, Oh, that'd have
Yeah, it would
been
have
great.
been.
Paul Darrow as Tekka, and oh, that'd have been amazing. Oh,
Oh
oh,
God, how did
the
they miss that?
the time lash we could have had.
I mean, would it have been better or worse better? I don't know.
um,
Two just kind of giant hams. Not like Stephen Greif is normally a ham, but I reckon if you put him in that setting, they'd both absolutely be,
I
yeah,
mean,
ripping shreds off each other.
nobody was taking Time Lash seriously, were they? But that's an
No.
interesting point. In a parallel universe somewhere, he was a Doctor Who villain in the late 70s or in the 80s, and I think
Mm.
that would have actually been pretty fantastic. But we've got an excellent performance here, and Big Finish, as I say, they did use him again elsewhere to various effects. He's also in. Is it Ghost Walk? He's the villain as well. Another monthly range.
I am going to embarrass myself now. I've actually heard Ghost Walk, and I don't remember spotting it.
I'm going to
But
embarrass myself even more. We did a podcast on it not that long ago.
ah,
Um,
I'll have to re-listen to it.
it is. It's Ghost Walk. He's the villain in Ghost Walk.
It's a good
And
release, though. I
yeah,
remember enjoying it.
he's excellent in that. It's another really, really sort of creepy, powerful performance. And he's definitely, I think he's the highlight of both Primeval and that. To be perfectly honest, he's absolutely brilliant.
I've just thought of a defense for myself. I think that might actually have been before I watched Blake 7. So there's a chance the last time I heard Ghost Walk, I literally didn't know who Stephen Greif was. I'm going to go with that. That's my attempt to defend myself.
I shall let you off this time then.
Thank you.
So let's move on to our next story, and it's one that we hadn't actually planned to talk about, but sort of decided we should probably just mention,
Yeah.
because we've obviously talked about Phantasmagoria, the first Fifth Doctor story. We're going to talk about the Fearmonger, the first Seventh Doctor story. So we thought it'd be rude to not mention Whispers of Terror, which is the first Sixth Doctor story at Big Finish.
Mm.
So it's getting an honourable mention, and I'll quickly add that I particularly like the fact that this is an audio drama that really takes advantage of the fact that it's on audio. It's not just giving us the first Sixth Doctor story. They could have gone with something fairly comfy and fairly traditional, and something that turns Perry into a bird-like creature or something like that. But instead they went, well, we're playing with the audio medium. Let's do something with that. Let's play with that. So Whispers of Terror, what are your thoughts?
Well, like you said, I kind of regretted not picking it in the first place because I suddenly realised we'd picked a couple of firsts and thought, right, okay, even if we're not going to do it, I need to remember it for due diligence, just how Colin got started compared to the other two. Um, and also, actually, I'm not sure I have ever heard it before. It's another one of those where I think it was kind of sat in my little pile of stories to get back to one day. But you're right, the choice to do an audio monster is a very interesting one to come to this early in the run because they do this sort of thing again a few times and they do find different ways to do it. So you've got kind of Ish, which is a brilliant kind of weird conceptual story about a language monster, and you've got Scherzo, I think is the pronunciation, the Eighth Doctor one. I don't know, Scherzo or Scherzo. Where
Scherzo.
there's
I've
there
always
we
had it
are.
as Scherzo, but I could be wrong.
Well, we'll stick with Scherzo, and Robert Shearman can tut unhappily at us if we're wrong. Sorry, Robert. But anyway, yes, it's a very clever, creative decision to go with that this early in the run. One thing I do find fascinating about the story is the companion pairing. So in this one, it's very very definitely season 22 Doctor and Perry. So literally in their first scene, they're both sniping at each other, and the Doctor in this is very much kind of a sarcastic blowhard, and yeah, Perry's kind of rolling her eyes a lot of the time, and I thought that was really interesting because it's one of those things I hadn't really considered is just how rarely the Sixth Doctor was paired with Perry in the early days. So if you go through the credits, or rather Nicola Bryde's credits on Big Finish, and look through the Colin stories, it's kind of one every 2 years or so, 2 or 3 years, until it gets a little more stable later on. And I wondered if the reason for that was Colin kind of going, right, well, we've done grumpy, snarky Doctor. Um, can we do something else? Because obviously it's all going to quantum leap in a minute into Evelyn, and that kind of different take on the Sixth Doctor. So yeah, I just found it really interesting that that we do open with that Sixth Doctor, and I wondered, maybe they deliberately did it, knowing they would move on as a sort of contrast, so they can go, well, look, he's got light and shade, because I think we all know that Colin, is very passionate about that character and his journey, so he would have had a lot to say. So yes, all of that, very interested by the behind the scenes stuff going on there. But as a story, um, it's actually really interesting. It doesn't just rest on its laurels. It doesn't just go, we've got a sound monster, isn't that great? Round of applause for the audio drama boys. It doesn't do that. It's also surprisingly upfront about the fact that that's what the monster is. So I kind of feel like if this was on TV, it would be more of a twist. Kind of, it might be halfway through, because this would have been 45-minute episodes. So maybe it would have been 2 episodes into this. We'd be like, it's an audio monster. But they don't do that. They're sort of upfront about it. And the reason for that is that there's more going on than just an audio monster. So you've got this political intrigue going on with Lisa Bowerman, who gets to play a complete monster, which is brilliantly jarring when you're only used to Lisa Bowerman being Bernice. Everybody loves Bernice. She's great. And it's just, oh god, she can play horrible as well. So that's great. She's got this extra dimension of playing this utter vacuum of a person who just wants, this awful political presence who wants to control the masses and disregard democracy. And so what you end up with is this monster. It's a sort of question of, well, is that really the antagonistic force here, or is it her? And that kind of just gives you a lot more to chew on in the story. And yeah, the monster ends up kind of playing a part in her downfall. So so yeah, even though I can sort of assume why we kind of departed from this Doctor Companion setup, and it seems a little strange in hindsight, kind of like we were saying about Phantasmagoria. There are some aspects of it that seem a little odd in hindsight. It seems a little odd to have a bickering Sixth Doctor and Perry. Um, it's a strong enough story that I'd recommend it regardless of questions of context and things like that. So yeah, it's a bit of a banger, to be quite honest.
It's everyone sort of credits Sylvester McCoy as being the Big Finish Doctor that sort of immediately knocked it out the park with the Fearmonger, which we are going to come to fairly shortly. But this is a very, very strong start for the Sixth Doctor, and you're right, it's not generally what we'd get from the Sixth Doctor at Big Finish. And again, you're right about the pairing with Perry. Even though the majority of the Sixth Doctor era on screen is with Perry, there isn't, even now, there isn't as much Big Finish with the two as you would expect. But it's it's again sort of straight out the door. We've got a really good, really strong story here, and Evelyn's going to come along soon. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But yeah, it starts strong and it stays strong, and I think it stays strong perhaps because of Evelyn. But it's good to just have this proper season 22 story, nice right at the start with a familiar pairing. And as I said, we're going to move on to Evelyn because the next story we're going to talk about is the Marian Conspiracy, which is it's a historical, and this is something that Big Finish, they still do every now and again now, but in the early days they did it sort of fairly often. They gave us that sort of William Hartnell era style, pure historical story. There's no aliens, there are no monsters. It's the Doctor and the Companion are getting involved with what's happening in the past, and that's about it, really. And there's a little bit of sort of sci-fi stuff around Evelyn, but ultimately it's still a historical story. It's a great way to introduce a companion. Evelyn is a great companion. And it kind of all starts here, and it is this nice, sort of fairly low-key historical story. So yeah, talk to us about the Marian Conspiracy.
Well, I said earlier that I wanted to avoid favorites and stuff. That was a blatant lie. Obviously, the Marian Conspiracy is a huge favorite, so it was a little bit of a struggle listening to it, thinking, well, what am I going to say? Because this is just really good. I would say with the historical thing, that's something that really fascinates me about Doctor Who because the sort of perception I had of fandom growing up, which was like the 90s when you've got all those non-fiction books of reviews and handbooks and stuff, was that everybody hated historicals. It was like, well, that's why they went away. They were rubbish. And I just think that's such a tragedy because I genuinely think if you have a TARDIS and an alien, which is the Doctor, and you add that to any story you want, it's got science fiction in it. So you can make that argument. You can be like, this story slots into the science fiction genre of Doctor Who, even if the story is not going to be killer crocodiles from Planet X or something. Um, so I just think that Doctor Who should be big and wide enough to encompass historicals. And in this one, yeah, like you say, there is a little bit of they throw you a bone. There's an element of history being rewritten, which gives you a nice little sci-fi button to add on to the thing. And I'm totally fine with that. I think that's more than enough science fiction content for this to feel like a natural fit for Doctor Who. And it's great the way it introduces Evelyn because, or Evelyn rather, because the story, it's about her. So it's needs to be her. It's a story you would have to include her in it because it's about her family and it's about her attitude to history. And I just really like that approach to the character. They haven't just gone, oh, we met this actor and we think she's really good, so we'll introduce her in Doctor Who. They clearly went, let's really round out this character. She's got loads of information just about her, and it just comes out of her in such an entertaining way. And the story really fits around her beautifully. And not to mention, it's such a dynamic just right away with the Doctor in her lecture, and he's got this annoying little beeping thing, which is Doctor Who all over. He's always got an annoying thing that goes ding, and she's just like, if you don't shut up, I will eject you from this classroom. And immediately, that's like the Sixth Doctor's bluster, and all of that is just water against a cliff. It's just not going to work. So you just have this relationship already where he's going to be trying to be his usual kind of clever self, and she's just like, well, I'm clever too. And not to say Perry isn't clever, of course she is, but Evelyn's a bit older, she's got a bit more experience, so she just doesn't take it for granted. She's just like, well, all right then, what do you mean? And he says, oh, you're not allowed to leave the TARDIS. She says, well, I'm a historian, I'm going to leave the TARDIS, so deal with it. And it's a really great dynamic. It's so clear why people latched onto it because it pushes the Sixth Doctor to stop trying so hard to be kind of the smartest and the brightest person in the room. He can kind of accept he's smart, Evelyn's smart, and it all starts here. And it's a really subtle story as well because you're presented with these characters who it should be, or rather could be, kind of black and white goodies and baddies. And you've got Mary, and she's just quite happily having people burned at the stake, which is just, it doesn't get much more black and white than that. But the story, and particularly the Doctor, kind of not agree with her, of course, but hear her out and say, well, look, whatever else you can say about her, she really believes she's doing the right thing here, and she's wrong. And there's a tremendous tragedy to this, even beyond the obvious. All the way through the story, she's just kind of presented as this person who's really trying and really wants to help people, but she's so dangerously wrong that it's just history will judge her. And there are moments where they try not to change history necessarily, but just to kind of buffer her and just be like, look, you can do this, but you'll be a monster. And she's just utterly unfazed. And I think that whole approach to characters as well, you've got sort of conspiracy going on to assassinate her, and that in itself is, that these people are trying to kill someone. I mean, that's not good, is it? But they kind of present it as, no, they really need change to happen because it's really damaging their lives. So I think the only character in it is there's a French character, I think his name's something like Philippe Denoy, and he's the only one who genuinely seems a little bit like he's a baddie, just kind of the way he behaves, and he sort of betrays his fellow conspirators at one point. But generally speaking, the story is very much presenting us with history and just saying, well, history happens. Some of it isn't very nice, and yeah, I think a historian companion, that's their bread and butter.
One thing sort of moving forward with this TARDIS team that I really like is they don't just use it as an excuse to dump the Doctor and Evelyn in history all week. Evelyn has this sort of very rich and varied set of stories, and she does visit present day Earth, she visits the future, she visits alien planets, she eventually settles on an alien planet. Um, but the fact that they sort of play to her strengths in this one and then go, yeah, but she's brilliant in all these other situations too. I really like that, and I think it's one thing that really makes Evelyn work as a character. They sort of set out to do something different with Evelyn, and it just worked. They created something brilliant, and this is very much where it all begins. She's awesome from the start. She doesn't become
Yeah.
a good companion after a few stories. She doesn't require that first few stories to settle into the TARDIS, and she's straight away. She's just in it, and she's brilliant. And a few releases in, she's saving Gallifrey from a Dalek invasion. Um, in a story that couldn't be any further away from this. But yeah,
Mm.
it's the fact that she's such a strong character to start with that makes her work in the more fish out of water stories. But yeah, it's a great companion introduction. It's a great use of the idea of historical. And okay, maybe we've seen Star Trek do this story a few times throughout the 90s, perhaps. Is Deep Space Nine's future tense maybe an influence on this, that sort of thing. But um, yeah, it's great. It's a really solid first story for Evelyn. It's a really good story for the Sixth Doctor. Like you say, a lot of Sixth Doctor perceptions are challenged within the first couple of scenes of this. And it allows the sort of character development that Big Finish have done with him, and that is obviously, like you said, very important to Colin Baker as well. Um, and we've got another Sixth Doctor and Evelyn story to talk about next, which is Blood Tide. And it's another one actually set in the past, but this isn't a pure historical. This one does have monsters in it in the form of Silurians, and of course, the all important first audio appearance of the Merker. Um, this is the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn meet Charles Darwin and Silurians and the Merker, and it's another sort of kind of rip roaring adventure. It feels like it's really fast paced. This one, it's your basic traditional Silurian story. I think it doesn't do anything too exceptional with them, but at the same time, it does do something interesting with the historical format, with Evelyn, with Darwin as a character, and I think Silurians are actually the perfect villain to have in this, and it was quite rare for Big Finish to be
Mm.
bringing back classic villains at this stage. I think they'd only actually done Daleks and Cybermen before this. Oh, and the Master um, was
Sure.
just
Well, you
was
got
just
to, haven't you?
was just breeding before or after. It was about the same time, wasn't it?
Ooh, I'm not
But
going to commit. I
yeah,
don't
no, don't
remember the
commit,
numbers
don't
or so.
commit. We're terrible fans. We haven't memorised the monthly range in order. It's just terrible of us. Um, but what are your thoughts on Blood Tide?
Well, you said, oh, and again, incidentally, this just further ruins my supposed try not to pick the favourites because, yeah, I love this one. You refer to it as traditional and rip roaring. I think that's exactly it. Um, this will sound like damning with faint praise, but it's not. I do think it's a tremendously trad story executed very, very well. Like, this is the kind of, on the surface, this is exactly the kind of Doctor Who story I would want. Um, you've got a bit of history, you've got a scary thing, and it's fast and it's entertaining, but everything about it kind of needs to be there. None of it's taken for granted. So we haven't got a story where you could have subbed in the Sontarans or something, and we haven't got a story where you could sub in Perry or something. It The Silurians being there enhances what the story is about. Evelyn being there enhances what the story is about. I mean, the whole thing, excuse me, revolves around her interests. So she's only here because the Doctor's kind of giving her a treat, letting her meet Charles Darwin, because that's something that's important to us. Already we can see that she's someone who means a sufficient amount to the Doctor that he will go out of his way to do something like this. And the choice of the Silurians, who you could argue even are not really a science fiction thing, they're more of an alternate history thing because because they were there first and all of that. So maybe I can tenuously still claim this as a kind of a historical leaning more towards pure historical. Yeah, we'll go with that. But the Silurians being here is brilliant because it challenges Darwin's theory before he's even had it. Because you've got, we all know the theory of evolution, but the uh, the sort of lead Silurian scientist very much posits, well, no, I made humans, like I just made that happen. So, and he doesn't outright say evolution doesn't make any sense, but the fact that he says something along those lines is just critically damaging to Darwin's perception, or you would think. In the course of the story, he kind of organically comes full circle and realizes that's not true, or at least that doesn't damage what he's thought. That actually enhances his understanding of humanity because humanity has changed since the scientists did this. And incidentally, for a traditional story, this seems like the best catch-all term for it. Um, it lobs in a hand grenade. Like humanity was made by the Silurians, apparently. That's an astonishing, massive revelation that I think Evelyn and the Doctor really take in their stride, all things considered. But hey, um, Darwin is fantastic in this. He's Miles Richardson, who if you'd been listening to lots of Big Finish up to now, you'd be like, oh god, that's Brachytale. But he's fantastic as Darwin. He's just filled with curiosity, but later he's filled with doubt. There's this amazing climactic scene where they have to kind of reenact the Curse of Fenric a bit with the old "you need to say something that you believe in" thing, and he starts trotting out Bible verses, I think, and then eventually the Doctor is just kind of saying to him, "No, no, no, something you really believe in. Come on," and he switches to his theory, and they use that. That's the climactic moment for him, is committing to his theory, and it's just such a neat piece of writing, and also really crafty for the Doctor, because we later learn that Darwin didn't really need to do all of that. It was actually the Doctor giving it some psychic welly, but he was deliberately helping Darwin along with that. And it's a really good one for the Doctor. Actually, there's a couple of moments in this where he's because we talk about the Sixth Doctor being sort of softer and sweeter with Evelyn, but he's still in there, and he's still funny and snide when the occasion calls for it. And there's a bit where the Silurian is one of the Silurians is arguing with him and kind of making their case, and they say, "Oh, we were here first," and he just goes, "We were here first." Like he's just the disdain he puts into that is just brilliant. Um, which is something Colin's very good at. He kind of really thinks about the delivery of every line. He's like, well, how can I get the most out of that? But yeah, the Silurians are great too. I think they really nail the vocal effect in this. It's a little bit of a subtle one as Doctor Who monsters go. It's sort of a strange noise. It's kind of a sort of a blobby sound. Is not Mr. Blobby? I hasten to add, but it's slightly difficult to make out what they're saying almost, even on TV. But they really get it right, and you really feel the performances there. Even though they've got all this distortion on them, you really feel that one of them is just utterly tortured and mad about what's happened to him because he was cast out by his people and now he's just consumed with ambition and revenge. And you've got this other one who she's gone along with him, and now she's kind of realizing that that's all the wrong thing to do, and the kind of regret in her voice is all coming through despite all of this distortion. So it's just, yeah, tremendous production just all round. And you mentioned the Merca. It has never looked better. Good lord, can't even smell the paint on it. It's genuinely, it's incredible what a difference it makes just not being able to see the thing. It reminds me of the Dalek Invasion of Earth novelization. Describes the Slither monster, and it does it as this terrifying predator, and that's such a great kind of subtle course correction from what was effectively a tarpaulin on the screen. yeah, the Merker. This story is very briefly, but justice for the Merker. So yeah, it's definitely a story I would rush into the hands of someone who's never listened to any audio Doctor Who and just say, "Here you go." They nailed it.
It's yeah, I think the Merker not only does it work better on audio because let's face it, it looked bloody ridiculous in Fury from the Deep.
Mm.
Oh no,
Oh,
Warriors of the
you
Deep.
wish.
Yeah, no, it looked absolutely ridiculous in Warriors of the Deep, but it's used more effectively here as well. It is used to attack a ship, um,
Yeah.
which it's better than just having it plodding along some overlit corridors. Like the way that it is written to be used is far more effective than how it's
Mm.
written to be used in Warriors. I also find it interesting that they use a Doctor Who and the Silurian on the cover, as opposed to
Yes.
Warriors of the Deep one, and we've got the Silurians voices as well. It's not the voices from Warriors of the Deep, so they're very much going for that early 70s Silurian as opposed to that one from the 80s that maybe they didn't want people to have in mind while listening to this story, because like Warriors of the Deep did do a bit of damage to the Silurians' reputation.
Yeah, that kind of makes it interesting that they have the Merker in it at all. Maybe I
Yeah,
guess they're kind of like, let's just try and rehabilitate. Because even the characters, I don't think they massively see the Merker. You know, like you say, it's attacking a boat. It sort of takes the Jaws approach. Like, it's just a thing that will happen to us. We don't need to focus on what it looks like. But yeah.
yeah, it's used well here. It's used far better than it ever could have been on screen.
Hmm.
And I'm glad that it does have its sort of little moment of redemption. It does kind of actually, and it makes sense that the Silurians have a sort of cyborg pet sea monster that they can use as a weapon. Because why not?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's move to the Seventh Doctor. So we've got two more stories to look at. Again, I think you've done some made some brilliant choices here. The Fearmonger is the first one, and it really is the Seventh Doctor entering Big Finish with a bang. What a
Hmm.
story! It's really strong. It's believably sort of where the series could have gone had it continued to exist into 1990. It's the Seventh Doctor and Ace carrying on after Survival. It kind of tips its hat to the new adventures, but it immediately sets out, no, we're doing our own thing. This is the Seventh Doctor and Ace in the 90s. We're picking up where Survival left off. And I think that in itself was a brave decision when Big Finish got started. They could very easily have gone, oh, well, actually, Ace left the Doctor and became a Dalek killer and fought in wars and then came back. And they didn't do any of that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a cracking story. It's very, very sort of strong politically. We've talked about it. I can't remember who I talked about it with, but I've talked about it on this podcast before, and we've sort of said that in many ways it could actually be considered more relevant now than when it originally came out, sort of nearly 25 years ago. So let's talk about the Warmonger. Go for it.
I think you mean the Fearmonger. I don't know what the Warmonger is.
Yes, I do. The
Sorry.
Warmonger is no, I've not even got anything witty. I've not even got a joke. The Warmonger.
That's fine.
It's its
There,
own
there
thing.
probably is a warmonger. I mean, just even in context, because we find out that there are monsters that kind of elicit different emotions. So there's a warmonger out there. So that's fine.
Yes, we'll go with
Um,
that.
yeah.
The Fearmonger.
Yeah. Sure. So yeah, we mentioned that it's a strong start for the Seventh Doctor, and I think at the part of that, obviously, uh, somebody wrote it, so it's their story, Jonathan Blum. But the Seventh Doctor era had such a kind of crystallized point to make, which I think was Andrew Cartmel saying he wanted Doctor Who to bring down the government, and it's just you can really tell with that era that it's trying to do something. And I think when the Series 24 set came out, I thought it was a really wonderful kind of example of you can see when they start to do that. So I really enjoy Time in the Rani, but once you get into Paradise Towers, you can immediately tell that there's this kind of emphasis on the Doctor as someone who's going to upset the status quo. And yeah, so this once you get into sort of season 26, obviously Curse of Fenric, he's all over the place with that, and Ghostlight, he's doing it with Mind Games. And in this one, it's really the kind of political thriller you would get in the New Adventures. So I think in a way that kind of gives the story a leg up, because you can kind of say, right, here is what the Seventh Doctor era feels like, and it feels like something that could only be that era. So this story wouldn't make as much sense, with Peter Davison in it or something. Um, but interestingly, when I inadvertently went back and listened to Whispers of Terror, there are actually some crossover elements in the two stories theme wise. So you've got a sort of a creature behind the scenes that's influencing people in some way. You've got a wicked politician who's putting out this kind of horrific far right feeling rather than thinking stuff. And there's a question throughout both stories of, is the monster actually responsible for this, and where does the monster lie, and things like that. I just think that's fascinating. I very much believe that's I forget what the term is. It's something like concurrent evolution or something, where two ideas come up completely independently. But it's interesting because of how the two different stories feel very different. Anyway, you're right that it's unfortunately aged very well. Like I wish it hadn't. The kind of horrible right wing attack of the story, or rather Jackie Pierce, her character, just the stuff she says. I think there's a bit where she says that she wants people to stop thinking and start feeling, and it's just that's I've heard that. That's very much the kind of playbook used these days. So there's a lot of themes in this that are just kind of, good grief, how is this more of a problem now than it was when this was written? But hey, that's good storytelling. It kind of finds something and highlights a real concern. Yeah, so I mentioned that there's the monster, and sort of where does it reside, and that kind of leads to a great kind of prolonged guessing game that really keeps going throughout the entire story. So there's a great cliffhanger to part 3 where we suddenly realize that this creature, where the whole point of it is that it's parasite, and it kind of latches onto people and uses them to elicit a fear response from people. It seems to be in the Doctor. So Ace then has to pivot kind of on the quiet to dealing with that, because she hasn't really got anyone to talk to about it massively. That would be the Doctor. So she has to just kind of subtly figure it out and deal with it on her own. And then that's not even where that particular process ends. It's a question of, is that the case? So yeah, it's a great kind of political thriller, and it really feels like Sylvester and Sophie are both responding very well to it, because there are moments in it where both of them really, get to, their characters are really caring about what's going on. There's a moment where Ace is shot. Oh yeah. There's a fantastic moment early on where Ace effectively talks someone out of blowing something up. He's got a bomb, and he's got a timer. He's got a timer with it. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the 7 stories, keep them all straight. And Ace's point is, well, you wouldn't have a timer if you actually wanted to blow it up, because this means you can sort of distance yourself from the whole thing. You're not going to blow it up right here and now, and this works. Later on in the story, she tries the same gambit with someone who's got a gun, and he just shoots her. And it's just a fantastic kind of raising of the stakes of, Ace has learned this. She's suddenly got this skill. Who knows? Maybe she picked it up from the Doctor, because he's got that happiness patrol thing where he's like, pull the trigger, end my life, all of that stuff. She tries it, and the guy shoots her, and he gets her in the shoulder. And there's this scene where she's in hospital, and the Doctor just sounds devastated that this has happened on his watch. And it's a shoulder wound. She's okay, although it does come back to bother her later on, which I really appreciated. I thought, well, it's good that we can be consistent with that. But it was such a lovely performance to kind of hear the Doctor, this Doctor of all, everyone always goes on about him being such a game player and psychic mind games and all of that, to be like, no, he also just fundamentally gives a damn about his friend. So yeah, there's tons going on between the characters in this, and like I said, Jacqueline Pierce is the villain in it, and again, another little accidental Blake Seven nod there. But yeah, she's so fantastic as this character, who's not really like Servalan. Servalan very much believes the nonsense she comes out with, whereas the political figure she's playing in this one, kind of differently actually from Lisa Bowerman's one in Whispers of Terror. I don't think the Jackie Pierce character here really does believe this stuff. I think she's just kind of using it. So there's shades of grey to that character. But yeah, so Fearmonger really feels like just kind of classic slice of what the Seventh Doctor era should be doing. Like you said, if they just carried on, and I think that really did give it a leg up. That's probably, I don't really know the reception of the story at the time, but that probably helped it. I think people would have listened to this and gone, yeah, exactly, that's exactly it. Whereas you might listen to Phantasmagoria and be a little bit like, well, I don't remember this era because it sort of wasn't really a thing. Whereas with this, it's just like they've got a gift. They've got both the actors willing to crack on and keep doing this stuff, and so they can just go, yep, let's do exactly what they should be doing. Um, yeah, it's an incredible first go for these characters. It's like, wow, they really got it on the first round.
There is that real sense of sort of picking up where they left off in the best possible way.
Mm,
It isn't sort of straight out of season 26. It is doing a bit more. It's a bit more grown up.
sure.
Um, I don't think the late 80s or even it would have continued into the early 90s. I don't think it'd have done anything so overtly political. I don't think it'd have done anything like that. There is an element of we've grown up a little bit. Ace has grown up a little bit. I think that's probably the most important thing. Um,
Yeah.
I can see there being a gap between Survival and this, but not a huge gap. And I do quite like that. I guess it's kind of the way that the Sixth Doctor and Perry's relationship kind of shifts between season 22 and season 23.
Mm,
There's obviously a bit of time passed. They've spent some more time together. They've mellowed towards each other. They're better friends now. Um, and yeah, there's a similar sort of shift here. But yeah, it works great as a story. I remember first listening to it and thinking that Ace actually getting shot was a little bit too over the top, bit gratuitous. But listening to it again recently, no, actually, that kind of fits. I like the idea that Ace is now pushing herself into that kind of dangerous situation because, as you say, it's kind of the Doctor's influence and the Doctor's reaction to it is fantastic. And
yeah, the
it,
context of it I think is really important too because it is the second time in the story. If the first time she tried something like that, she got shot, I think that would be quite gratuitous. That'd be like, oh, this isn't your granddad's Doctor Who. This is violent. Anything can happen. But the fact that she does successfully avoid a violent confrontation earlier kind of makes it more unexpected, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I quite like that this, like I say, it sets the seeds for or plants the seeds for a more mature Ace, a more sort of world weary Ace, and an Ace that can talk herself out of situations and be a bit of a leader. And that's
Hmm.
something that becomes really important when Hex comes in, because in many ways, Hex is Ace's companion, not the Doctor's. Um, and that kind of it
Yeah.
all sort of starts here. And there's something really rewarding about listening to this and dust breeding and the rapture and coldits and all that kind of thing before you get to the harvest and carry on with the hex stuff. It really does feel like there's development for Ace. And I know people kind of go, oh well, it started that whole McShane storyline that went nowhere. It doesn't matter. Ace, they were willing to develop Ace as a character from the start. And I think that has led to some really, really great stuff from Big Finish.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it feels like there's been a gap, and I think in the case of sort of Colin and Nicola, it feels like the Doctor and Perry, it feels like they've mellowed and they've sort of got over their sort of rough edges. With Seventh Doctor and Ace, it feels like they've just got better at what they do,
Yeah,
and obviously they're closer as friends because they've been through stuff like Ghostlight, but they're like a little troublemaking unit, and they're very kind of because this one also a little bit like Primeval kind of starts with the ball already rolling. There's quite a bit of stuff has already happened, and yeah, you do get the feeling that this is their day job. Like they're not landing places and being like, we could potentially have a nice day. but if there's a dead body, I guess we'll get inveigled in some shenanigans. This feels like the Doctor's deliberately going somewhere and being like, "Ooh, something a bit iffy there," and Ace is like, "Yeah, let's sort it." So I do like that progression.
Yeah, very much that the Doctor going in to sort a situation, which again is where seasons 25 and 26 sort of went.
Mm,
So, in a lot of stories in those two seasons, the Doctor lands somewhere with a purpose. Remembrance of the Daleks, Happiness Patrol, Ghostlight, Fenric. It's all very much he's landing somewhere because there's work to do, and it follows on from that as well. Yeah, it's a great little continuation of where the 80s may have been going, the late 80s may have been going.
mm,
Um, and our next Seventh Doctor story it's something quite different. I'm disappointed we didn't actually get more of this. I think this is a cracking story, and I think that it does something strange and interesting and ventures into territory that Big Finish seem to have generally, for the most part, avoided since. So it's Shadow of the Scourge, which was it a sidestep that it was credited as? Was it like this and um,
I think the Dark Flame was the other one.
Dark Flame was the other one, and then there was obviously the Holy Terror as well. They were kind of billed as
Mm.
sidesteps, and it was kind of stepping into book and comic territory. And it's a story where we get the Seventh Doctor, Benny, and Ace just as a functioning TARDIS team. And I,
Mm.
I really like that. I kind of actually wish we'd had more just sort of traditional Seventh Doctor, Benny, and Ace four-parters. This and like a couple of others. That's basically it. There's not much at all. Um, so, what made you pick Shadow with the Scourge?
Partly it was lack of familiarity. I have heard this, but it was probably 5 years ago or something. But also partly since I heard this, I've read all of the new adventures because I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, which was because of Big Finish actually, because I heard their love and war story and was kind of like, okay, now what? So I went off and read the whole kit and caboodle. I'm also really sad that they didn't do more of these. I read there's a great Big Finish book which is out of print, but if you ever come across it, it's great, called Bernice Summerfield: The Inside Story by Simon Guerrier, and it's got loads of information about all of the Benny books and most of the audio dramas. Obviously, it has to cut off eventually. And I was reading about Shadow of the Scourge, and they were saying how effectively Shadow of the Scourge and Dark Flame were two of their worst-selling releases, and I think that's bizarre. I mean, I know Dark Flame was a little contentious. I think people reacted quite poorly to that one. But Shadow of the Scourge is a very strong story. I think there's a sort of element of people feeling like they can't just jump onto anything related to the new adventures. Like if you've missed the boat, it's too late. Which I think is a shame because, first of all, having read them, I think they're a hell of a lot more accessible than they themselves kind of put themselves out there as. They're advertised, or they were advertised, as being too broad and too deep for the small screen, which is very grandiose. And I can kind of see why they want it to be grandiose, but at the same time, it's a little bit off putting because you're kind of like, you are talking to Doctor Who fans here. You don't want to tell them this is not like Doctor Who. Because a lot of the time it was, quite frankly. And this story, I think, exemplifies a lot of the stuff about the new adventures that worked. It doesn't feel like you've got to do any homework because you've just got the Doctor, Bernice, and Ace just having an adventure. The stuff that makes it kind of new adventuresy is more subtle. So because it's hard to kind of throw a dart and hit. Well, what are you going to do with this audio adventure that's going to make it a new adventure, apart from just adding Bernice and switching out the costumes, which you can only tell from looking at the front cover anyway. Um, and I think it's about internalizing stuff. So you've got characters who are, you know, living and breathing, and they've got a lot going on in their lives. There's a lot of side characters in this who have family histories and kind of family struggles, relationship problems, and stuff like that. So we just by virtue of the fact that a new adventure novel is going to be longer than a target book, we got loads more of that in the new adventures. And there was also kind of a tendency to focus on people's uh, literal inner lives, like their mental landscape or whatever. So inside their minds. So there's bits of this where we're inside people's minds, but particularly we're inside the Doctor's mind, which is, a slightly radical idea in terms of stuff like, classic Doctor Who wouldn't do something like that, but the books were always doing stuff like that. And there's a bit in this where the Doctor kind of, or rather, I think Bernice is in there with him, kind of perceives his other selves kind of hanging around, and that's a very Paul Cornell thing that he did in Time Worm Revolution. He kind of came up with that Guardians of the Edge thing that we have in the Power of the Doctor, where kind of somewhere inside the Doctor's mind, the other Doctors are just kind of ticking along, like they're still there to an extent. That's kind of nodded at in this story, but yeah, it's a very strong one for the Doctor. He's got plenty of stuff. He gets to be a game player, but he's trying to stay one step ahead of these aliens. It's kind of an invasion of time story for him, where it looks like he's collaborating, but really he's not, and it goes wrong as it does in the invasion of time. I think it's a bad idea. I think that's what we should take from this. Stop trying it. It's not a good idea. But yeah, he gets to really kind of have to reassess what he's done and the damage that it's doing to people. And Bernice, it's I think it's acknowledged actually in that book I mentioned, the Inside Story. Sophie Aldred acknowledged that the dynamic was a little bit hard to get into, where you've got the two characters, and I think the problem there is just that we have to hit the ground running with this. Like, we can't ease people in and go, here are some new adventures, right? Now we're all used to this. So it was kind of a left field thing. Like with the Holy Terror being a one shot, that's easy. You don't need to do any, you don't need to think about it to adjust to the idea that the Sixth Doctor's just on his own. With this dynamic, it's a little harder. And Ace in the New Adventures novels is very different to the one in the books. And, sometimes to her detriment, they kind of made her more of a soldier character. And that's something that's become a bit of a trope, really, for the character since then. She's supposed to be kind of sexier and more violent, if you can believe it. And the picture on the front cover is actually her in a Sophie Aldred in a kind of 90s photo shoot, looking like the character on the novel First Frontier, I think it was. So for Ace, anyway, what I'm very badly trying to get at is I don't know if there's very much for Sophie Aldred to latch onto as kind of New Adventures Ace. It's a difficult thing to do. So with Bernice, pretty much the character in the novels is the same voice as the one you would have got in the Big Finish Bernice Summerfield stories. So Lisa Bowerman, who, much like Colin Baker, tremendously cares about the voice of that character and how she's portrayed, she can kind of slot into this. Whereas with Ace, it's mostly sort of normal Ace. So I think that kind of holds it back a little bit from feeling like a new adventure. But Sophie Aldred is still great in it. There's a very funny sequence of events where the monsters are kind of able to control you through sound. So she suggests that somebody kind of temporarily deafen her, which is obviously not something I would recommend anyone try, and I'm not sure it would work quite the way it works in this, but we'll go with it. But it's really funny the way it kind of just keeps coming back to be just this utter annoyance for her. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. I really wish that we had got more, but I can perfectly understand if the numbers weren't there. Maybe they'd go, right, okay, that's not going to work. I think the problem is that they tried it too soon. I kind of wish they'd held out and come back to it later on. And, because at this point in time, we've got the luxury of looking back and going, Big Finish loves spin-offs. And back then, that they were rare. You had your Bernie Summerfield, you had all sorts of crazy other stuff, but Doctor Who-wise, not a lot going on. So I wish we'd got more. I certainly wish we'd got some Doctor and Bernice adventures. That's something that bothered me in the books. They're not enough of just the Doctor and Bernice. The two of them work together fantastically, and I think they're only in about less than half a dozen novels as a duo. So that's something that makes me sad. I wish it had been possible for Big Finish to. It's not too late, mind you. There we go. There's an idea. Big Finish, please do Seventh Doctor and Bernice adventures. That'll be fab. Not that I don't love having Ace around as well, but it's just there's a specific dynamic to those two. Um, yeah.
I'm in complete agreement. More Seventh Doctor and Benny would be absolutely brilliant. Um, when I first heard this, I'd never gone near a new adventure. I knew very little about them, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good story. I was aware of who Bernice was. I was aware of where she'd come from. In fact, I'm about to slightly retract what I just said. I might have read Human Nature, just Human
Okay.
Nature. But yeah, I was totally willing to accept, yeah, this is Benny on audio. She's absolutely brilliant. And yeah, it was the first time I'd kind of come across the character, really, except, like I say, possibly reading Human Nature beforehand. Um, yeah, it's sort of it's really good. It's wonderful stuff. And I think that had Big Finish done it a few years later, like you say, maybe it could have led to something else. Maybe we could have got a bit more, and it is never too late. Um, but yeah, I think that as the only Doctor Who story that came out that month, I can see why people kind of went, "Oh no, not sure about that." However, if it had come out now, when we've got a box set or two of a Doctor each month and a spin off and a Torchwood and all of these things, then it probably, yeah, it had been received quite differently, I think. Just great idea, just perhaps the wrong time.
Mm.
Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for. But it's
Yeah.
been great to look at these stories. I do, like I said at the start, really like revisiting these early Big Finish days and just sort of seeing what they tried, what worked, what didn't, what they got started with, how they introduced all of these characters that we now know and love. Evelyn, for example. Yeah, it's been a good little set to talk about. I think we'll be back sometime fairly soon to talk a bit more about Evelyn because sort of preparing for this, we realised how much we love the character and how little attention we've given her as a podcast, really. So I think an Evelyn episode should definitely be popping up fairly soon. In the meantime, though, I will say a huge thank you to Gareth for joining me.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
And yeah, we'll be back for more podcasting very soon. Goodbye now.
Ta-ta.